The manhwa begins with the surrender of the human king to the vampires, who apologizes for his ancestors and offers them anything in exchange for sparing his life. We are told that the battle ended with the victory of the vampires, and their leader decapitates the king while telling the rest that this is the place for all humans. Then we see the battlefield filled with human corpses, where two vampires seek to finish off the last group. Among them, a girl tells them that they don't have much time left because God spoke to her in a dream, saying that he will send a hero to save the humans. But the vampires mock her and say that there is no tomorrow for them. Then a vampire lunges at the humans, dodging and slicing the first one who tries to confront him in two. The next one leaps at him, but with a single move, he cuts him in half, and he impales another one who remained paralyzed by fear. There, an elderly warrior attacks him from behind, but the vampire stops his sword with his hand and cuts it in half, and then he finishes him off. The vampire then tells the children that he will now kill them without pain. But as he is about to strike, he hears a scream that catches his attention. The vampires turn around and see that it's a knight, the protagonist, whom they ask who he is, and they realize that he doesn't smell like a living human, so he must be a corpse. The knight leaps forward, and the vampire acknowledges his bravery for attacking the vampires when he suddenly appears in front of him. And while the vampire reflects on the fact that the protagonist covered 10 meters in one jump, we see that the protagonist has finished off the vampire, so his companion jumps to kill him and manages to impale his heart with his sword. However, the protagonist doesn't die, and as the vampire fails to understand what is happening, the protagonist grabs him by the head and pierces his heart with a single blow. The girl calls him a hero, and the protagonist tells them that they will find a sanctuary if they walk in a straight line. She asks him if he is the hero that God sent to save them, but then the protagonist takes off his helmet and asks them if he still looks like a hero in their eyes, and his nose falls off, so the children scream that he is a monster and run away. Then we are told about the rumor of a vampire fighter, the only knight who could not die. Some time before, we see a group of scientists entering an abandoned coliseum, where they find the corpse of the protagonist who died standing, having been the greatest warrior of that era, with 228 victories and 0 defeats, and the best artificial body capable of defeating vampires. The scientist asks about the condition of the corpse, and they tell him that the decomposition is still within tolerable limits. Then the scientist removes her mask, and we see that she is a girl who says that in desperate times, the hero will live forever. Then we see the protagonist on top of a pile of corpses, and someone congratulates him for being the survivor once again. Suddenly, he wakes up, and the scientists say it is a success. The protagonist says he was certain that he died, but the girl tells him that he was born again to save humanity. They bring him a mirror where the protagonist sees himself hanging from chains and without limbs, so he calls himself a monster. But the girl tells him that he is the last hope of humanity, and in his brain, there is a device called the life-sustaining apparatus. Unless destroyed, it prevents the protagonist from dying even if his body explodes. In addition, he can use a modified body and limbs with special muscles that will allow him to fight better than the vampires. Then the protagonist asks if that is the reason they brought him back to life, and they tell him that it is, and they ask him to fight alongside them to save humanity. The protagonist says he has a condition and asks someone to come closer to listen. But when the general does, the protagonist traps him with his thighs and says that his condition is for them to stop talking and get him out of there, while stating that he became the greatest warrior because he doesn't hesitate to kill people, and that humans are as dirty as vampires, and the fact that they have him like this is proof of that. So, he only cares about his own life, and if they don't want him to kill the general, they must give him arms and legs so he can leave. Then the girl takes out a watch and says that the protagonist only has 4 seconds left. He faints after asking what she is talking about. Some time later, the protagonist wakes up, and they explain that the fuel that keeps him alive is the life of a human being. And we see that he is connected to the girl, who tells him that she needs him to inject life into her so she can move, and it only lasts for 2 hours, as she, named Evelyn, is the only human with a motorized body that the transplant worked on and the only one who can carry him. So the general asks him if he will fight for humans to keep her alive and for him to be able to live. Suddenly, vampires appear in the facility. They say they are looking for treasures and beautiful women, so the protagonist tells them to hurry up and connect their limbs. The general agrees and asks the scientists to buy them some time. But they are not warriors and say they don't want to die, so Evelyn grabs a crossbow and runs towards the vampires to buy them time. They ask her if she's not afraid to face them alone, as they are superior to her. But Evelyn shoots and tells them they talk too much. The vampire manages to stop the arrow and furiously lunges at the girl. She continues shooting, but she can't stop the vampire. He kicks her down and then lifts her by the neck, telling her she has a beautiful face. This makes the other vampire say that he wants her, and they start fighting over her. When the protagonist appears and destroys one of their heads, he scolds Arian for letting her guard down and fighting carelessly. When the vampire returns and says she is his, the protagonist is surprised that she hasn't died, and Arian tells him that vampires regenerate if their heart isn't destroyed. The vampire attacks again, so the protagonist pushes Arian away and takes the blow directly. But nothing happens to him, and with a single strike, he sends the confused monster flying. There, the other vampire takes the opportunity to go after Arian, but the protagonist stops him too, surprising the girl and the general. They realize that despite having the same strength as the vampires, the protagonist is not aiming for their hearts because he is enjoying the fight. The warrior finally immobilizes the vampire, who asks him who he is and if humans now create monsters, to which the protagonist says it's unfortunate for those to be his last words. But when he is about to kill him, the vampire says he has an offer that he is sure they will like. The protagonist decides to listen, and the vampire warns him that if he kills them, his lord, Benzel, will find out and come back to avenge them in 1 hour. The protagonist asks why someone named Benzel would avenge them, and the vampire says it's because he is the only one in the world who loves them. So, if he hands over Arian, he will let the rest go in silence. The protagonist says no, but he can give them the general, and the vampire says he's of no use to him. So the protagonist kills him and says that the negotiations end there. The protagonist also kills the other vampire and asks who Benzel is. Arian tells him that he is a high-ranking vampire and explains about the types of vampires that exist. The first are pure blood vampires, who have been vampires since birth. Then there are the high vampires, born with the blood of the pure blood vampires. And then the low vampires, born from the mix between a junior vampire and a pure blood vampire, the rank to which the two they killed belong. Arian also tells him that there are few high-ranking vampires and they are vulnerable to sunlight. They are also powerful enough to defy human logic. The general tells them they should prepare to face Benzel, but Arian asks the protagonist first if he will really help them fight against the vampires. The protagonist reflects for a moment and says that he only cares about his own life, but there's not much he can do in that situation, so he agrees to cooperate for the time being. Arian thanks him, and the protagonist asks to connect with her to recharge energy, but before that, she tells him she has a gift. And then we see the protagonist in armor, and the general asks for his opinion because he made it based on several drafts. But the protagonist says it's in poor taste. There, Arian tells him that it's made of mithril and was designed to be very resistant, and minimize damage since he is slower than the vampires. And she explains that there is an approximate estimation of the remaining time he has to move on his wrists. Then they start hearing strange noises coming from the ceiling, and the protagonist says they are already coming down, and there are many of them. This surprises the general because only 40 minutes have passed. The protagonist asks Arian to cut the connection and asks her about the entrance and escape route, but she tells him there is only one entrance and exit, and the protagonist complains that she should have told him earlier. At that moment, the noise seems to have arrived, so the protagonist puts on his helmet and tells them to stay behind him, and 3 heads peek through the door. These heads say that it was the protagonist who killed their family, and he confirms that he dealt with them. So the heads congratulate him and say it was good that he defended himself since they tried to kill him, and they apologize to him. The protagonist is speechless and tells the general that he got scared for nothing if he is Benzel. So the bald one steps forward and apologizes for murdering his family. But since he killed his companions, they should be even. And since she is willing to talk, they should leave it at that and go their separate ways. He says that would be fine. However, they swore to Julius that they would kill all humans. The group says they were already expecting that. So the protagonist asks him if he's okay with that because it seems like he's too strong for them to handle alone. This makes Benzel laugh, who says that humans are amusing and that low-ranking vampires are only there to protect the high-ranking ones when the sun comes out. Otherwise, no one could kill them, as we see that Benzel is composed of hundreds of faces, earning him the nickname the Face Collector. Arian realizes that the faces are connected by blood, so there must be a body among them that, if they manage to destroy it, the rest will collapse immediately. Suddenly, Benzel lunges at the girl, but we see that the protagonist saves her while saying that the vampire is faster and stronger than he thought, and he tells her to go to a safe place. Benzel is about to devour a scientist when the protagonist punches him and saves him. And as he strikes the faces, he says that if he doesn't know where the body is, he'll just have to destroy everything. Benzel praises him for his power and wonders if there was anyone with such strength among humans. But he says no and asks him back why he wants to know, when Benzel traps his fist with one of the mouths. And he tells him that his bite is more potent than his strength, so once he catches him, he won't be able to escape. The protagonist tries to free himself with a punch, but Benzel also traps his arm, as well as his legs, leaving him immobilized. And then he takes him inside, telling him that there lies the true hell. We see a crying child in a land full of dead people, whose screams haven't been heard by anyone in days, until suddenly the cries are no longer heard. But the child didn't survive with someone's support but with their own strength. And we see the protagonist inside Benzel, who says that his biting strength is incredibly strong, and he wonders if his limbs are already broken and where the escape route could be. And he concludes that it's below, but his chances are minimal when suddenly he hears a voice saying, "Dirty vampires," and he sees a bunch of faces clamoring battle cries against the vampires. Then Benzel says that the name of the first one is Albert Lauren, a hero who fought against vampires to save hundreds of people. But now he's just part of his collection. The protagonist then realizes that they have hair and a pedestal unlike other faces, so he asks if he's special. And Benzel says it's because of their beautiful faces, and their noble sacrifices will endure there until the end of humanity without aging. However, the protagonist tells him that his face will hardly be there. He tells him, on the contrary, that his willpower and strength are the best among all the heroes he has seen in years. But the protagonist tells him it's because of his appearance, and Benzel asks if he's really that ugly. So the protagonist asks him to take off his helmet, and the vampire says he's a monster. So the protagonist asks him to let him go since he doesn't need him. But Benzel says he won't be able to do it in that condition, to which the protagonist responds that he's not the only one with teeth, and he starts biting the faces. Benzel tells him that it won't be enough because no one has managed to escape from there. But the protagonist tells him that he's not no one, but Gunther, who no matter what happens will ensure his survival, while biting and destroying the faces. Outside, humans wonder if it's the end, and the general says that the protagonist was not the savior of the species, so humanity is lost. When Aryan warns that some faces started to fall, and the protagonist appears, making his way through blows. So the general shouts that he always believed in him. There, they see that he lost his legs, and he tells them to change the plan because he has no chance of winning. And he carries Aryan on his back, while saying that the new strategy is to flee until the sun rises. Benzel attacks again, and the protagonist narrowly avoids it. Aryan tells him that she has some spare limbs for him to use, but he says there's no time and he needs to increase the distance between him and the vampire as much as possible. So he starts running, and Benzel catches sight of Aryan's face, prompting him to chase after them to get her. Both of them manage to hide, and the girl tells him that there are 5 minutes left until sunrise, so they plan to run towards the exit. When a scream catches their attention, they see that the general and the scientists are about to be devoured. The protagonist says they will take advantage of their sacrifice to escape silently, and he asks Aryan if she understands that it's for the future of humanity. But after staring at each other, she goes out screaming at Benzel that she's there. So the monster attacks her, and the protagonist rescues her again, telling him that if they can save them, they must give it their all. Thus, the protagonist has no other choice and says they will make their way through. Then he makes a leap towards the exit, narrowly evading Benzel, and they manage to reach the stairs, while the monster tells Aryan that her courage moved him and asks her to please join him. The pair almost reaches the top when Benzel grabs the protagonist's arm, which he destroys with a blow, and they manage to get outside. But then Benzel catches up to Aryan and takes her back inside amid the desperate cries of the protagonist. We see one of Benzel's faces on the ground, witnessing the arrival of the sun and starting to burn, just like others at the entrance of a cave. Inside, we see the protagonist injured, and the vampires ask if he's okay. He tells them that his family's revenge failed because of a monstrous night, so the vampires offer to seek revenge on his behalf. But he tells them that the protagonist is not someone they can deal with, and he can't afford to lose more members of his family. So he must be the one to deal with the protagonist, and he asks them to bring him new faces. Later, we see that the vampires have gathered a group of people, and they tell Benzel that they have brought him 34 individuals. Among them are 7 with beautiful faces. Benzel tells them that they are great faces and that they did a good job. But he says that he still likes Aryan's face more. He turns to the girl and tells her not to be afraid because once inside him, she will witness the end of humanity in his company. In a scene change, we see the protagonist shouting at the general to connect his limbs faster. But the general asks him not to look at him since he can't perform when being watched. The protagonist still rushes him and tells him they will move as soon as he has his legs attached since he has less than half the time remaining. He also asks if he will be able to move without Aryan, in case they manage to develop a new motorized body, but the general asks him if he wouldn't save Aryan if that were the case, and he tells him it's impossible because the device in his head is not something that regenerates his corpse, and that's why when a certain degree of decomposition is reached, it cannot be brought back to life. That will happen in 3 days, after which the protagonist's body will completely stop, rot, and can no longer return to life. The general explains that it's because they did it in a dangerous place, and they found out about his death late, so they ran without eating or drinking to arrive before his body decomposed. And developing more motorized humans won't be possible in the coming years, so without Aryan, he will most likely die. The protagonist then asks what the device in his brain is, but the general cannot tell him yet, and he will consider telling him when they build more trust in their relationship. The general finishes attaching his legs and says everything is connected, but the protagonist says his right arm is still missing, to which the general responds that he prepared something special for that, and although it's still incomplete, they were developing a modified weapon for long-range use, and he asks what the protagonist thinks about it, which excites the protagonist. In a scene change, one of the citizens is offered to Benzel. He uses their blood to wrap his head and join it to his being, terrifying the other captives. And he tells Aryan that now it's her turn. He says that stiff, fearless eyes in the final moment are his favorites, and he wants to see the moment they realize the truth and become stained with fear. But Aryan tells him that the most terrifying truth for her at that moment is that no one has saved Benzel's heart. So he tells her that she's very funny and that he will make her repeat that over and over again when he has her face. But then one of the villagers shouts and rushes at the vampire with a knife, while telling him that he has been waiting for the moment to catch him off guard. But then we see that he was immobilized by the faces, while the vampires apologize for not stopping him. The villager shouts that even if he fails, another will appear to pierce his heart. And Benzel says that it's always fun to meet a hero like him, as he believes it's worth sacrificing for humanity. And that is a repugnant and vain belief because he is aware of all that. There, he tells him that his horrible hand is like that because he saved some people from a burning house, which ended up melting his flesh, but he still ran to save at least one more. And although he received praise and respect from people for a while, what he mostly got was contempt and disappointment. The villager asks why people did that, and then Benzel shows him his face and tells him it was because of how it ended. The villager becomes terrified, and Benzel says that those who called him a hero started to hate him after seeing his melted face, and he lost his place in the world because no one wanted a monster like him, despite sacrificing himself for humans. Benzel covers his body again and tells the villager that his sacrifice is in vain because humans only harm people. However, the villager tells him that his past doesn't justify the killing and that he's just a murderer. And he's about to get his face when the protagonist says he talks too much and a projectile is fired. The protagonist asks about the weapon's accuracy rate since it flies at his command, and the general tells him that's why he warned him that it was still incomplete. Aryan feels relieved to see the protagonist, and he feels the same seeing her alive, and he tells her that he was going to kill her if she died. Benzel calls him an idiot for crawling there with his own feet and says he must want to die. But the protagonist tells him it's the opposite, and it's time for the second round because they're running out of time, and one of them has to be dead by the time it's over. The general explains that the weapon is called a bone launcher, and it is a massive muscles that surround the bone spine. These muscles slowly contract to the limit and accumulate strength, and then release it to shoot bone spikes with destructive power and speed stronger than any crossbow. However, after firing the 6 bone spikes, they become useless. But the protagonist says that he will still be able to keep his distance from Benzel. There we see him and the general on their way to the cave, and the general tells him that he must kill him within the little time he has left. Otherwise, they won't be able to escape from the low-class vampires. Those vampires will disappear if he manages to kill Benzel, although he doesn't know if it will be possible to do it so quickly. And the protagonist tells the general that he may die, but he is sure that he will survive. Back in the present, the protagonist says that he only has 15 minutes left, but he is confident that it will be impressive. Benzel says that it's interesting what he has prepared, but by stacking several layers of faces, he will create a barrier that cannot be penetrated. Then the protagonist shoots again and pierces through all the faces without any problem. He says that he failed again, but now he knows exactly where to shoot, so the next one will pierce Benzel's heart. Benzel tells the vampires to stay away, but they tell him that they are faster than him and will immobilize him. So Benzel agrees, and the vampires rush at the protagonist, being cautious of the bone weapon. But he tells them not to worry because it's not for them, and he kills the first one using his fist. Another one appears from behind and grabs the protagonist, saying that they won't be defeated by him. The protagonist grabs his face and says that he is not yet strong enough, but he manages to make it explode and throw him away. Benzel attacks him, and the protagonist dodges while other vampires try to trap him, but he kills them with a single blow until one dying vampire manages to grab his foot. And he tells him that Benzel is the only one who treated them like people, so they vowed to give their lives for him since then. But then Benzel tells the vampire that he did well, and we see that the monster managed to put the protagonist's head in its mouth. And he tells him that this time he will chew his face first. But the protagonist shoots another spike to free himself and kills the vampire on the ground with a kick. He dodges an attack while thinking that he must be careful because he only has 3 shots left. But all the faces look the same, and he doesn't know how to locate Benzel. Then Arian starts shouting the monster's name, and the vampires try to silence her without damaging her face too much. The protagonist wonders what she's doing when another low-class vampire attacks him and kills him with one blow. Then Arian starts shouting again, and the protagonist thinks she has gone crazy when she tells Benzel that he is a horrible monster, and one of the faces grimaces. Benzel tells her that it makes no sense for her to crawl like that, but the girl tells the protagonist to take a closer look, because there are some faces that react, and those are the ones that are closest to Benzel. The lesser vampire holds Arian to silence her, but then the protagonist shoots to see Benzel's reaction, and he finds the face that moves first, so he shoots and finds the vampire. He tells him that even so, if he doesn't succeed on the first try, it's over, and when he hides among his faces, it won't work again. There he realizes that some of his nerves were severed and he must reconnect them. But the protagonist tells him that he won't be able to, as he still has 2 shots left, and he will give it his all now. So he shoots again and destroys Benzel's arm. The protagonist runs while saying that it's the last step, and the vampires stand in his way to block him with their bodies. When he shoots his last spike, piercing through them and disintegrating Benzel's face, but he didn't manage to hit him in the heart, and Arian says it's a failure, warning the protagonist that he will have to destroy the device in his head. However, he emerges from among the vampires and says that he hasn't failed yet because he still has 1 shot left. Arian asks him what he's talking about, and as he is propelled towards Benzel, he says that the last shot is his own body, just as the vampire finishes regenerating his head. Long ago, we see a man who says he joined the city guard because he believed that saving humans was the most valuable thing in the world. Just like his father, he wanted to be a hero who fights to save humans. But then we see his deformed face, and that man is Benzel. Children on the street throw stones at him for being a monster and looking disgusting. This plunged him into despair, and he asked his father if his sacrifice for humans was truly worth it. If sacrificing himself for those who treat him like a monster was worth it. And he no longer knew what to believe in or what to do. Then we see a vampire putting his hand on his head. And this vampire is Julius, who says he has been observing him for a long time and wants to create a new world. But the process will be very harsh and painful, so he needs the help of men like him. Benzel then asks him what kind of world it will be, and Julius tells him without us knowing what it is about. But what he tells Benzel moves him. He asks Benzel if he will be with him, and Benzel agrees, just as we see the protagonist's fist pierce his body, while saying that it is his victory. In his last moments, Benzel wonders if the world Julius wants includes a monster like the protagonist. Benzel then disintegrates, and along with him, all the low-rank vampires, and the protagonist faints. Some time later, we see a caravan, and the protagonist wakes up aboard it. He stands up and asks what is happening when Arian tells him to be careful because they are connected, and that he won't be able to move aggressively for a while. She thanks him for his hard work, as they were able to save many lives thanks to him. And the general tells him it's incredible because he didn't expect him to get rid of a high-ranking vampire in such a short time. The protagonist says it was close and asks if all the low-rank vampires also disappeared, which the general confirms, saying that the vampires responsible for collecting blood disappeared to join the pure blood vampire. So the protagonist asks if it wouldn't be easier if they directly eliminate that vampire. To which the general responds that in theory, yes, but Arian tells him that Julius, the last pure blood vampire, has not been seen at all, except for the day he killed the king, and the protagonist asks why, if he is supposed to be very strong. But she tells him they don't know because Julius doesn't participate in battles at all. This makes the protagonist suspicious, and he says that vampires are supposed to feed on human blood. But if they are going to kill all humans, they would run out of food, so their goal is contradictory. And even though they think the same, the general tells him that they can only fight and survive for the moment. So they go to the headquarters to get more details, the last human city that hasn't fallen, where the research on the protagonist and the design of his body were conducted. At that moment, the caravan arrives, and the general tells him to see the last place of hope for humanity called Bahal, when suddenly they see that it is on fire and the protagonist mocks it. We see a vampire sleeping when suddenly he wakes up screaming that Benzel is dead, and if the enemy is finally there to kill him, and he tells his mom that he doesn't want to die. While she calms him down and tells him that there is no enemy, she says it's sad news because Benzel was a fragile but beautiful vampire, but it's hard to believe that a human being killed him. So Julius asks a vampire named Yen to find out who killed him. Then we are given information about the city of Bahal, which is called the Holy Land for several reasons. And one of them is that it seems like God made it perfect, since it's on the edge of the continent. And although it didn't grow much, it's a land that can produce its own food. And it is protected by mountains and the sea, making the only entrance through a bridge, which facilitates defense even when the enemy outnumbers the defenders tenfold. The protagonist's group arrives, and he says that the place is already destroyed. Then the general finds a soldier named Leonard, who is glad that everyone is okay. But when he introduces himself to the protagonist, he seems to despise him, so the protagonist angrily asks who he is. And the general introduces him as the leader of the wall guard, who asks them to come in. The group enters the city, and the protagonist asks why everything looks so bad. So Leonard explains that they had to give up the defense of the outer bridge. The general asks what the problem is, as they believe that defeating Benzel would give the city some relief. And this surprises Leonard, who disdains the protagonist again and explains that a vampire invasion began when they left. It was a force they had never seen before, with strange and twisted appearances, and shows they put on to massacre the soldiers, which the protagonist finds amusing. He also tells them that they broke through the main gate, which they managed to block, but the next invasion caused too much damage. So he asks the protagonist to stay there to protect the bridge until the city is repaired. However, the protagonist refuses because he says they can serve as flesh shields for him to live longer. This infuriates Leonard, who tells him that he's alive because 136 of his comrades died in experiments to become motorized humans, just like the researchers who built his limbs, and all the soldiers who protected the city while they did it. But the protagonist is a gladiator who knows nothing about sacrifice, and he tells him that the dead knight should have been him and not the protagonist. Then he approaches him and whispers in his ear that he's a piece of shit, which angers Leonard. The soldier tries to attack the protagonist, but he sends him flying out of the building, and Aryan reminds him not to act aggressively while they are connected, to which the protagonist agrees and says it was in self-defense. Later, we see Leonard returning but injured, and Aryan tells the protagonist that no matter how strong he is, he can't do it alone, because it takes a lot of manpower and supplies to make his limbs, so they must save as many people as possible and defend the Holy Land to ensure the supply doesn't get cut off. The protagonist then agrees to fight and asks to be shown his weapons, but the general says there are only two, which surprises both Aryan and the protagonist. And Leonard apologizes, as almost all the personnel were dedicated to defense, so they didn't have time to build weapons. And the protagonist says they should at least give him a properly functioning arm. Then he tries another one, which turns out to be a shield that changes size and is fire resistant, so the protagonist says it's not bad. There he asks when he can have another bone launcher, but Aryan tells him it will take more than half a year due to the materials. Later, the protagonist finishes choosing a sword and says he is ready to fight. Aryan tells him that they went through a whole selection process, and he was the most suitable, so he shouldn't worry because she believes in him and that he will save the world, although that didn't matter to him in the first place. Then the protagonist asks if there were 136 humans who tried to become motorized humans, to which she says yes, and the protagonist asks her why she did it after seeing 136 die, to which she replies that it was what needed to be done, and he says he doesn't understand. Both of them wait in the building when Leonard appears and warns them that the vampires are already there. Gunther goes out to the entrance and disconnects, so Aryan asks him to survive. And after putting on his helmet, the protagonist says he will, and that no matter who comes, he will tear them apart. Then a silhouette appears on the horizon, who says that today's audience is only one person. The protagonist thinks that Evelyn's stance is strange and doesn't seem to move quickly, so he plans to use a jumping attack. And when he gets close, he will kill her with a single strike. Then the vampire welcomes the audience and introduces herself as Evelyn, who has prepared to give a perfect performance. And the first act is the king of the pigs and her. Suddenly, the protagonist jumps and declares it's his victory, But when he strikes, he doesn't feel any contact and wonders how she avoided it. Evelyn tells him that he's a rude audience and must follow the order of the performances to maintain the rhythm. And we see that her body is contorted as she says that the first part of the show is the king of the pigs and the choir of dwarves. Then she uses her blood power, and a huge tent appears in front of the protagonist. Suddenly, a vampire dwarf emerges from it and attacks him. The protagonist repels the attack, and he sees an army of them surrounding him and attacking him together. But he effortlessly defeats them with a single blow and continues killing them mercilessly. More of them come out of the tent, and the protagonist tells them to stop wasting his time because they are weak. He makes his way to the tent to cut the leader's throat. But suddenly he sees something else inside, and a blast of flame comes out of the tent to attack the protagonist, who blocks it with his shield. Then a massive pig appears, and the protagonist understands the title of the act. The pig breathes fire again, and the dwarf says that its fire burns everything, telling the protagonist to turn into ashes. But he sees that the protagonist is still alive, so he tells the king to unleash more power. The protagonist prepares his sword and throws it towards the pig, asking them if they think they can kill him with just that. And then he jumps forward to kill both of them. The protagonist says that what they prepared is much less than he expected and asks them where the second part of the performance is before entering the tent. The protagonist enters and tells Evelyn that she decorated everything with great taste. She thanks him and tells him that he is the first to reach that point for the second part, so she prepared it with all her heart. But the protagonist doesn't let her finish and launches another attack. She manages to dodge it again, and the protagonist can't believe that she's avoiding it. Then she uses her powers again, and blood covers her completely, while saying that the second act is the confession of the suffering clown Evelyn, and she hopes he enjoys it. The battle begins, and the protagonist launches fast attacks around her, but none of them manage to hit her. So the protagonist throws a barrage of debris at her, but she dodges them all. And from her mouth, she pulls out two swords with which she attacks the protagonist, who also manages to block her for a moment. He wonders how he can land an effective blow when she catches him off guard and throws him out of the tent. On the walls, the group watches the confrontation, and the general asks Leonard how the protagonist is doing, to which he says they are losing ground, as the protagonist's attacks don't seem to work, although he took care of the dwarves. The fight reaches the bridge, and the protagonist propels himself forward to attack, but still fails to land a hit, so he tells Evelyn that she's as stupid as a cockroach. The general asks if there is any way they can help him, but Leonard says that all the siege weapons were destroyed in the previous battle, so they can only use bows. But Arian says they should avoid fighting on the bridge since the protagonist's muscles are too dense. And as we see him falling from the bridge, she says that if he falls into the water, he will sink without being able to return to the surface. Something heavy falls into the water, but then we see that the protagonist managed to cling to the bridge with his sword, since Arian warned him that if he fell into the water, he would sink, and with such a strong current, even a normal person would be swept away. The protagonist checks his remaining time and sees that he has little left, so he thinks it will be a difficult fight. There, Evelyn launches herself at him again, and the fight continues. The protagonist says that she is definitely strong, much stronger than Benzel, but that the general and Arian will soon make a big move, when suddenly they call him and tell him to retreat. The protagonist quickly enters the castle, and the soldiers indicate the direction he should go, so he wonders what the plan is. The protagonist reunites with the group, who tell him that the strategy is to hold out until dawn while they initiate the charge, since he is the only one who can fight a higher-ranking vampire on equal terms. There are 5 hours left until dawn, so Arian tells him that he needs to recharge every 2 hours. The staff starts to change his arm and perform maintenance when the girl tells him that the operation has a major weakness, and that is that recharging his energy takes more time than he thinks. The protagonist asks how long, and she tells him that it takes about 20 minutes to refill the 2 hours of charge. Plus, he needs to be in a stable state to receive the energy properly, so he can't recharge during combat or while fleeing from vampires, so they need a way to protect him and Arian, and the protagonist asks if it's possible. There, Leonard opens the door slightly, then closes it, and we see that the city soldiers are preparing to fight. While Leonard tells him that they need to hold on for 20 minutes, the protagonist says that ordinary people are never a match for high-ranking vampires, so if they wait 20 minutes, everyone will die. And the general tells him that he knows, as do all the soldiers, but they still went out to fight. Outside, the soldiers form a formation, and Leonard says that if they don't burn there and now, who will light up that darkness? When suddenly the gate is broken, and inside the building, the group hears the agonizing screams of the soldiers. Outside, we see that Evelyn killed them all and is about to finish off Leonard when the protagonist manages to trap her, and he asks her if she didn't expect a man to come out of the wall. Leonard asks him what he's doing since he still has time to recharge, and the general is surprised that the attack worked with just one arm, as they remember the protagonist's words, who told them that now that he's used to it, fighting with just one arm won't harm him, and since only 5 minutes have passed since he started recharging, the energy could last him until morning, and he takes Evelyn to fight elsewhere, saying that it's the location of the third act, at the bottom of the ocean where no one can escape. Both fall into the water, and the protagonist manages to hit Evelyn, so he tells her in his mind that it is difficult to fight in that environment. As he begins to pierce through her body, he tells her that he will break her heart that way. Evelyn screams in pain, so she wraps around the protagonist like a snake and impales him with a sword in the arm. She then tears it off, but when they reach the bottom, the protagonist also tears off one of the vampire's arms. So they continue to mortally wound each other until the bottom explodes in blood, and we see Evelyn trying to escape. But the protagonist appears and manages to bite her, thinking that it's all over. He tears off her flesh and exposes her heart, while asking her in his mind if she believes she can kill him. He is about to bite her heart when she is about to pierce him with her sword. Suddenly, we see the protagonist's memories, in which a woman reminds him that no one goes to the dump where she found him, and he himself said so. He was dying and he spat out a small scream with all his might. So curiosity got the better of him, as nobody wanted him to be born. For him, who was dying with the garbage, screaming for help had meant a lot. We see the protagonist after having defeated dozens of opponents, and she says that now she knows what it means, and it's revenge, since nobody wanted him to be born or alive. Just like he cried for help as a baby, he must fight until the end and survive like a demon. Because he deserves power, he will receive it, and with it, he will avenge the world that abandoned him. And the protagonist understands it, so she tells him to prepare for the next act, as it is time to show their will. And then we return to the present, where the soldiers find the protagonist's head among the rocks, saying that he was very lucky. Arian holds him in her arms, saying that it is a relief that he has survived once again. And Leonard says to take him inside quickly because the fight is not over yet. After receiving the charge, the protagonist tries to vocalize something, but since he doesn't have a body, he is unable to speak. So Arian tells him to wait a bit until the body and legs are finished. This frustrates the protagonist a lot. Some time later, he regains his body and says he was so frustrated that he thought he was going to die. He asks them if they took care of Evelyn, but Leonard tells him that they believe she is still alive. The protagonist says it's not possible because he remembers biting her heart. But Leonard tells him that they found the footprints of a woman coming from the sea, so it must have been the high-ranking vampire he fought with. They followed the trail and found a suspicious carriage, which they assumed is the vampire's hideout. But even though the sun came out, they were no match for him, so they didn't confirm it. The protagonist tells them they must have seen it wrong because he bit her heart with his teeth. But Leonard says they need to check the security and asks the protagonist to go before it's too late. Some time later, we see that the protagonist accompanied them to the carriage, which indeed looks suspicious, but he is certain that he bit her heart. Leonard tells him to hurry inside. The protagonist approaches and finds a bunch of fresh footprints, as well as seeing that the windows are blocked, so it seems like a vampire hideout. But he has the advantage that the sun is up, and if something goes wrong, they can bring it down with the carriage. Although everything is quiet, despite the possibility of minor vampires trying to prevent the attack. Then the door opens by itself, and the protagonist enters, thinking it's empty. When it closes again, the protagonist is attacked in the darkness. However, he knocks one of the dwarves away and captures another to tell them to stop. The dwarves cease their attack, and the protagonist tells them they are too weak to be vampires, to which they respond that it's difficult to walk or fight there because their bodies are a failure, and they can't beat him now. So finally, it's time to end the show. The protagonist reprimands them for killing people without hesitation, but the dwarf tells him it's what they promised, and the vampire's promise is absolute, and he will show him around for the final act. The dwarf leads him through the place, where many more dwarves are watching from the darkness. So the protagonist says they are very noisy despite not being pigs. There, the dwarf explains that they were not raised as humans, as their owners wanted them to be obedient pigs and make them a good product. Then they reach the end of the place, and Evelyn formally presents herself as the last and most beautiful product. The protagonist realizes that she doesn't seem willing to fight, and she welcomes him in a friendly manner. The protagonist asks her how she's alive despite him biting her heart, and Evelyn explains that she only bit a part, enough not to die, but since it's the source of her power, if it's not intact, she can't control the blood. And the protagonist says that if that's the case, she's just a piece of firewood in the sun and prepares to attack her, while saying that this time, he will be the one to survive. Outside, Leonard and the soldiers are still waiting, and the leader asks them how much time they have left. The soldier says 50 minutes, which is a lot of time, and says they will only enter if they haven't heard anything from the protagonist when there are 10 minutes left. Then another soldier asks if those vampires used to be human, because he heard that orphaned children and city vagrants kept disappearing, and he found a very strange facility while searching for their whereabouts, where there were tools for breaking bones, and a lot of steel frames, in addition to small crushed and broken skeletons piled up like mountains. It was a place for manufacturing merchandise, where they prepared and sold them. And the smaller the size, the more twisted the selling price. The other soldier asks who would buy something like that, and the narrator says they are just rumors. But the buyers were traders and aristocrats who bought them as symbols of wealth or power, and some of the survivors were sold to circuses. He thought it was a ghost story, but if it's true, the vampires are the victims, and the leader they are trying to capture is human, so he asks if it's really worth it. Inside the hideout, we see that Evelyn evaded the protagonist's attack. She asks him to hold her tight because she is going to scrape and break his bones, since even when she screamed for them to kill her, they ignored her. And she tells him that one day they suddenly let her go, so she asked them why they bothered her so much and then easily gave her freedom. To which they only responded that the pandemic was over. Then she tells the protagonist that, finally, she has a question, and it is what is trendy now. To which the protagonist replies that fun is trendy, but no matter what happens, he will survive until the end because that is the story of a man. And Evelyn says that is also a tough and lonely performance, and the protagonist delivers the final blow, killing them all. Back in the city, a villager tells another that 2 high-ranking vampires have already been killed in Bahal, and it must be because they made some kind of weapon, and a large number of survivors are arriving in the city. They say there were 8 high vampires, so there are only 6 left, and now they are heading to the city, so they should help. But they say their side of the sea is the most likely to survive since vampires hate water. When the sound of something enormous catches their attention. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you have reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you have been one of the few people to make it here, so comment the word night in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.